Finance too.
So there's three explanations that we often hear from industry about why these issues that I've recounted to you today should not be of concern. The first, we hear that there has never been a single proven case where hydraulic fracturing has contaminated groundwater. Well, this is a bit like Bill Clinton, saying that he didn't inhale, or, well, it depends on the meaning of sex. This is semantics. It leaves out, according to Lee Fuller, policy analyst who was instrumental in the federal exemption for hydraulic fracturing and also instrumental in energy in depth. It leaves out everything around the fracturing process except for the period when the fracturing fluids reach their targeted level of pressure and the fracturing actually occurs. So it excludes the transport of the chemicals, the mix of those chemicals, the injection and preparation of those chemicals, the removal of the waste, and the disposal of that waste. This is the reason that the EPA is now considering the life cycle process around hydraulic fracturing in this new study, and not just the question of quote-unquote hydraulic fracturing. I believe this is the reason that you hear David Neslin say earlier that the view is broadening to consider more of the life cycle impacts. The second response that we often hear is that fracturing happens so far underground that it cannot be connected to the surface, that there's no way for whatever goes deeply 10,000 feet underground to wind up in a drinking water aquifer. Well, we've discussed, and you've heard from a number of people today, evidence to the contrary. In one interesting anecdotal example, I've been reporting with a gentleman in Wyoming, in Pavilion, Wyoming, named Lewis Meeks, and Mr. Meeks has had extensive problems with his water, his drinking water related, he believes, related to drilling. I won't go into the whole backstory, but it's somewhere in the middle of his story. He brings in a contractor to drill a new water well on his property. They are drilling this water well, and there's a blowout in the water well, and methane explodes out of the well, knocks the entire well structure off of its foundation, and spews gas and water into the air for a couple of days. At the same time that blowout happened, there was a significant drop in pressure at a nearby, about a mile away, at a producing gas well run by a cannon. When they did finally plug Mr. Meeks's water well, the pressure rose again accordingly in the nearby producing gas well. To me, again, in addition to the other comments that we've heard today, implies some sort of geologic connection between those two areas. And again, just to emphasize for the third time, the wellbore itself, even if those other geologic pathways are disputed or can't be proven or wind up not to exist, the wellbore itself creates a pathway. If there wasn't a crack going from 10,000 feet below into that aquifer, well, we just put one there when we drilled that well. The third argument that we hear is that fracturing fluids are less than 0.5% chemicals, and vast majority of them is water. But in the shale play in particular, with the high volume horizontal hydraulic fracturing that involves 4 or 5 millions of gallons per well in Pennsylvania, in New York, possibly here, this can mean 10,000 gallons of chemicals injected straight into the ground as part of that mixture. We never get the information, and again, I've asked in terms of solution, in terms of the scientific language that's usually used to represent contaminants in water, parts per million or parts per billion kind of measurement. We just get this loose association of a percentage. We'll keep in mind as we pump 10,000 gallons of chemicals into those water resources that it takes 5,000th of a milligram of benzene to contaminate a liter of water. It doesn't take a lot. I apologize for mixing my units. I'm Americanizing the conversation, but I think you get the point. So how is all of this regulated? For the most part, in the United States, it's left to the states. There's varying degrees of oversight. In my opinion, from my research, generally weak. And many states that are, and some of which you've heard from today, are working very hard to strengthen those regulations. Colorado in particular should be applauded for its efforts. It began its program of revising its regulations before I started reporting on this issue, before it was a major national controversy, and in the face of quite a bit of opposition. New York also, I believe, has done an extraordinary amount of work and made great progress. Presently, other states revising and strengthening their regulations include Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and New York. Few states regulate hydraulic fracturing to the extent that the federal government probably would if it were to do so in the United States. That is to say that few states would monitor and then approve the hydraulic fracturing process before it happens, that they would require that there's a geological analysis and investigation into the specific location where the fracturing would take place to make sure that the ground there can contain the fluids that are pumped into it. And few states would require the detailed logs. You heard a bit about cement bond logs today, but the detailed cement and casing analysis that can ensure that a well is ready to handle the kind of pressure that would be forced on it in a fracturing operation. These federal regulations, if they were to be enacted, would set a baseline. So rather than Colorado's regulations being an example of the best case scenario, those regulations might become the minimum standard. All wells would be drilled to that standard or better. It just moves the bar. State regulators also, in almost every state that I talk to, are extraordinarily overwhelmed. And this was even before the rush. And the rates of hiring have not come even close to keeping pace with the increasing rates of drilling. So the ratio of responsibility from inspectors to number of wells has increased massively. Pennsylvania, in response to this, and to their credit, doubled its inspector force last year. It hired 70 new inspectors, more than any other state regulatory agency in the country. Colorado has as well. In Texas, a single regulator can cover as many as 4,000 wells a year over a space of hundreds of miles. And if you just sit down and do a little bit of math and imagine driving across the spacious state of Texas, and imagine how that possibly gets done. At the federal level, in the United States, fracturing is exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act, as you've heard. The Safe Drinking Water Act is the regulation that applies to all other forms of industrial underground injection. The natural gas industry, the energy industry is the only industry with such an exemption, and it means that this baseline not only doesn't exist but can't exist. We will continue to rely on state regulation to varying degrees to regulate the fracturing and the drilling processes. Federal studies are underway nationally. There's a large EPA study that's looking at hydraulic fracturing from a life cycle perspective across the United States. And there's a second, smaller study which isn't specific to hydraulic fracturing but is addressing many of these issues in Pavilion, Wyoming, where I described Louis Meeks's water well, and where the EPA's most recent round of testing found hydrocarbon-related contaminants in 90% of water wells that they tested there. There are several versions of legislation passing through the U.S. Congress right now which would begin to address this, which would require disclosure of the chemicals used in fracturing and allow the EPA to regulate, if they chose to do so, give them back that authority. But these pieces of legislation don't seem to be going anywhere fast. They're in various states of disrepair and lack of attention.